The ancient amphitheater carved into the mountainside had witnessed 1,000 years of ceremonies, but none as momentous as the ritual of choosing that would take place this dawn. Princess Lyralei stood at the very back of the gathered nobility, her simple grey dress a stark contrast to the elaborate gowns and jeweled tiaras that surrounded her. She had learned long ago to make herself invisible at such gatherings. It was easier than enduring the whispered comments and barely concealed disdain of the court. The kingdom of Ethermore had been without a queen for 3 years, ever since the mysterious death of Queen Seraphina. King Aldric, known throughout the realm as the Shadow King for his dark magic and even darker reputation, had finally bowed to the pressure of his council and agreed to choose a new bride. The ritual was ancient, dating back to the founding of the kingdom, and required that every unmarried woman of noble birth between the ages of 18 and 25 present herself for consideration. Lyralei pulled her worn cloak tighter around her shoulders as the morning mist swirled through the stone seats. At 22, she was well within the required age range, though she suspected her presence was more of a formality than a genuine possibility. After all, she was the forgotten daughter of King Aldric's deceased brother, a reminder of a succession crisis that had nearly torn the kingdom apart 15 years ago. Her father, Prince Demon, had been the rightful heir to the throne, but his sudden death in what many whispered was a hunting accident had cleared the path for Aldric's ascension. Lyralei had been 7 years old then, old enough to remember the warmth of her father's laugh and the way he used to call her his little star. Old enough, too, to understand that her very existence was an inconvenience to the new king. The other noble ladies clustered in groups, their nervous excitement palpable as they discussed their chances and strategies. Lady Cassandra of House Ravencrest, with her platinum blonde hair and sapphire eyes, was widely considered the favorite. She had been groomed for queenship since childhood, educated in statecraft and diplomacy, and possessed the kind of ethereal beauty that poets wrote songs about. "I heard the Shadow King prefers brunettes," whispered Lady Vivian to her companion, unconsciously touching her own dark curls. "My mother says Queen Seraphina had hair as black as midnight." "Beauty alone won't be enough," replied Lady Isadora, adjusting her emerald necklace. "He'll want someone who can bear him strong heirs and navigate the political complexities of the court. Someone with powerful family connections." Lyralei listened to their conversations with a mixture of amusement and melancholy. She possessed none of the qualities they deemed essential: no powerful family to back her claim, no dowry worth mentioning, and certainly no political influence. Her guardian, the elderly Lord Matthias, had been her father's closest friend and had taken her in out of loyalty rather than ambition. He provided for her basic needs, but had neither the resources nor the inclination to position her as a serious contender for the throne. The sound of horns echoing across the amphitheater silenced the chatter as the royal procession began. First came the King's Guard, their black armor gleaming in the early morning light, followed by the members of the Royal Council in their ceremonial robes. Finally, preceded by the ancient banner of House Shadowmere, came King Aldric himself. Lyralei had seen the king from a distance at various court functions, but never this close. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 35 at most, with the kind of commanding presence that seemed to bend the very air around him. His hair was dark as a raven's wing, and his eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray and turbulent. There was something predatory in the way he moved, like a wolf surveying potential prey. And Lyralei understood why the common people both feared and respected him. The Shadow King's reputation was built on more than just political maneuvering. He was said to possess magic that could bend shadows to his will, could walk unseen through the darkest night, and could read the truth in a person's heart with a single glance. Whether these stories were fact or carefully cultivated legend, they had served to keep his enemies at bay and his kingdom secure. As King Aldric took his place on the obsidian throne that had been carried up from the castle for the ceremony, the high priestess Morwen, stepped forward. She was ancient beyond measure, her white hair flowing like water down her back, her blind eyes milky with cataracts that somehow seemed to see more than normal sight ever could. "Behold," her voice carried clearly across the amphitheater despite her age. "The ritual of choosing begins as it has for 1,000 years. Let every maiden of noble birth step forward to be seen by their king, that he might choose the one who will stand beside him as queen and mother to his heirs." The selection process was both simple and terrifying. Each young woman would walk alone across the ceremonial circle, pausing before the throne while the king studied her. If he was interested, he would extend his hand. If not, she would continue walking until she exited on the far side. Her chance at queenship ended forever. Lady Cassandra, as the daughter of the most powerful duke in the kingdom, had the honor of going first. She glided across the circle with practiced grace, her silk gown catching the light like spun gold. When she reached the throne, she executed a perfect curtsy and lifted her eyes to meet the king's gaze with just the right mixture of respect and confidence. King Aldric studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The entire amphitheater held its breath, waiting for his decision. Finally, almost imperceptibly, he shook his head. Lady Cassandra's composure never wavered, but Lyralei caught the flash of disappointment in her eyes as she completed her walk and exited the circle. One by one, the noble daughters presented themselves. Lady Vivian, with her dark curls and nervous smile. Lady Isadora, with her emerald jewelry and practiced poise. Lady Arabella, with her musical laugh and golden hair. Each was beautiful in her own way, each was accomplished and well-connected, and each was dismissed with the same subtle shake of the king's head. As the morning wore on and more young women were rejected, a murmur of confusion began to ripple through the crowd. The king's standards appeared to be impossibly high, or perhaps he was looking for something that none of these carefully groomed candidates possessed. Lyralei found herself moving closer to the front as the crowd thinned. She had assumed she would be among the last to be called, given her low status, but the alphabetical order of the ceremony meant that House Shadowmere would be announced sooner rather than later. The irony of sharing a name with the royal house, a reminder of her father's rightful claim, was not lost on her. "Lady Lyralei of House Shadowmere," the herald's voice rang out, and suddenly every eye in the amphitheater was upon her. The whispers started immediately. Many of the younger nobles had forgotten she existed, while the older generation exchanged meaningful glances that spoke of old scandals and buried secrets. Lyralei felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she forced herself to walk forward with as much dignity as she could muster. The ceremonial circle felt vast as she crossed it alone, her simple grey dress and unadorned hair making her feel like a sparrow among peacocks. She was acutely aware of every whisper, every stare, every barely concealed sneer from the assembled nobility. This was exactly why she preferred to remain invisible. Moments like this, when her inadequacy was on full display for all to see. As she approached the obsidian throne, Lyralei risked a glance at King Aldric's face. What she saw there surprised her. Instead of the dismissive indifference she expected, his storm-grey eyes were studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch. There was something almost familiar in his gaze, as if he were seeing not just her, but something deeper, some memory or recognition that she couldn't understand. She executed her curtsy, though it lacked the polished perfection of the ladies who had gone before her. When she straightened and met his eyes again, she saw something that made her heart skip, a flicker of what might have been approval, or perhaps something even more surprising. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions and possibilities. Lyralei was vaguely aware that the crowd had grown restless, that whispers were beginning to rise like the buzz of angry bees. She should move on, should complete her walk of shame and return to her place in the shadows where she belonged. But King Aldric was still watching her, his head tilted slightly as if he were listening to something only he could hear. His hand, which had remained firmly on the arm of his throne throughout the morning, began to move. The gasps from the crowd were audible as the Shadow King slowly, deliberately, extended his hand toward the forgotten princess. Lyralei stared at the offered hand in shock, unable to process what was happening. This had to be some kind of mistake, some cruel joke that she didn't understand. Kings didn't choose forgotten princesses with no dowry and no political value. They certainly didn't choose the daughter of the man whose death had paved their path to the throne. "Take it," King Aldric said quietly, his voice carrying a note of command that brooked no argument. "Take my hand, princess." The title, one she had not heard spoken aloud in years, sent a shiver through her. With trembling fingers, she reached out and placed her hand in his. His skin was warm, his grip firm and sure, and the moment their hands touched, something electric seemed to pass between them. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs and outright protests. Lord Ravencrest, Lady Cassandra's father, rose from his seat with an expression of outrage. "Your Majesty, surely you cannot be serious. This girl has no dowry, no political connections, no what?" King Aldric's voice cut through the protests like a blade, and the temperature in the amphitheater seemed to drop several degrees. Shadows began to gather around the throne, responding to his mood. "No right to be here, no claim to nobility. I would remind you, Lord Ravencrest, that Lady Lyralei is the daughter of my brother, Prince Demon, and carries the blood of House Shadowmere in her veins." The reminder of her lineage sent another wave of whispers through the crowd. It was true that she was technically a princess, but her father's death and her subsequent obscurity had made most people forget that fact. "Furthermore," the king continued, his grip on Lyralei's hand tightening slightly, "the ritual of choosing is mine to conduct as I see fit. I have made my selection." High Priestess Morwen stepped forward, her blind eyes somehow finding Lyralei despite her lack of sight. "The king has chosen," she announced, her ancient voice carrying the weight of tradition and law. "Let the ritual be completed." What followed was a blur of ceremony and tradition that Lyralei barely comprehended. Ancient words were spoken, ritual objects were presented, and formal declarations were made. Through it all, she remained standing beside the obsidian throne, her hand still clasped in the king's, trying to understand how her life had changed so completely in the span of a few heartbeats. The other noble ladies filed out of the amphitheater in various states of disappointment and shock, their carefully laid plans crumbling around them. Lady Cassandra paused as she passed the throne, her sapphire eyes meeting Lyralei's with a mixture of confusion and something that might have been pity. "I hope you know what you're doing," she murmured, too quietly for anyone else to hear. "The Shadow King is not known for his mercy, and queens who disappoint him have a tendency to disappear." The warning sent a chill down Lyralei's spine, but before she could respond, Lady Cassandra had moved on, leaving her alone with the implications of what had just occurred. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, King Aldric finally released her hand. The absence of his touch left her feeling strangely bereft, as if she had lost something important without understanding what it was. "Come," he said, rising from the throne with fluid grace. "We have much to discuss, Princess. And I suspect you have many questions." Lyralei nodded mutely, still too overwhelmed to form coherent words. As she followed the Shadow King from the amphitheater, she caught sight of Lord Matthias in the crowd. Her guardian's face was pale with shock, but when their eyes met, he offered her a small, encouraging nod. Whatever had just happened, whatever game the king was playing, there was no going back now. The forgotten princess had been chosen, and her life would never be the same. As they walked toward the castle, King Aldric glanced down at her with those storm-grey eyes. "Tell me, princess," he said quietly, "do you know why I chose you?" Lyralei shook her head, not trusting her voice. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth, the first genuine expression she had seen from him all morning. "Because," he said, "you're the only one who didn't want to be chosen. And that, my dear, makes you either the most honest woman in my kingdom or the most dangerous." The words sent another shiver through her, though whether from fear or anticipation she couldn't say. As the castle gates loomed before them, Lyralei realized that her quiet, invisible life was over. Whatever lay ahead, whether it was queenship, danger, or something else entirely, she would face it as the forgotten princess who had somehow caught the attention of the Shadow King. The game had begun, and she didn't even know the rules. The royal chambers assigned to Lyralei were more luxurious than any space she had ever inhabited. Tapestries depicting the history of House Shadowmere adorned the walls, while furniture carved from rare shadow wood gleamed in the light of crystal chandeliers. A four-poster bed draped in midnight blue silk dominated the room, and tall windows offered a breathtaking view of the kingdom's capital city sprawling below. Yet despite the opulence surrounding her, Lyralei felt like a prisoner in a gilded cage. 3 days had passed since the ritual of choosing, and she had barely seen King Aldric except for formal meals where conversation was stilted and watched by dozens of courtiers. The engagement had been announced throughout the kingdom, but the wedding date remained mysteriously unset. A soft knock at her door interrupted her brooding. "Enter," she called, expecting to see one of the servants who had been assigned to attend her. Instead, a woman she didn't recognize stepped into the room. She was perhaps 40 years old, with silver-streaked auburn hair and intelligent green eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of Lyralei's appearance and demeanor. Her dress was well-made but not ostentatious, suggesting someone of importance, but not nobility. "Your Highness," the woman said, offering a respectful curtsy. "I am Lady Morgana Blackthorn, the King's advisor on special matters. His Majesty has asked me to speak with you." Lyralei gestured for her to sit in one of the chairs near the fireplace. "Special matters?" Lady Morgana's smile was enigmatic. "Magic, politics, and the intersection between the two. I've served the crown for 15 years, through some of its darkest hours. I knew your father, Princess. Prince Demon was a good man." True. The mention of her father sent a pang through Lyralei's chest. "You knew him well?" "Well enough to know that his death was no accident," Lady Morgana said quietly, her eyes fixed on Lyralei's face to gauge her reaction. "And well enough to know that you inherited more than just his bloodline." Lyralei frowned. "I don't understand. Have you never wondered why you can see things others cannot? Why you sometimes know things before they happen? Why animals are drawn to you, and why you feel most at peace in the moonlight?" The questions hit uncomfortably close to home. Lyralei had always attributed her strange intuitions and occasional prophetic dreams to an overactive imagination. The way woodland creatures seemed to seek her out, the way she could sense people's emotions, the way shadows sometimes seemed to whisper secrets. She had learned to keep these oddities to herself. "I see I've struck a nerve," Lady Morgana observed. "Your father possessed the gift of foresight, Princess. It's a rare form of magic that runs in the bloodline of House Shadowmere, though it often skips generations. King Aldric has his shadow magic, but he lacks the ability to see beyond the present moment." "You're suggesting I have magic?" Lyralei's voice was barely above a whisper. Magic was not uncommon in Ethermoor, but it was typically the province of trained mages and those born to powerful magical bloodlines. She had never considered that her strange experiences might be something more than imagination. "I'm not suggesting it. I'm stating it as fact. The question is whether you're willing to learn to control and develop your abilities." Lady Morgana leaned forward, her expression serious. "Because, Princess, you're going to need every advantage you can get." "What do you mean?" "The king didn't choose you randomly, despite what the court believes. He's been searching for someone with foresight for 3 years, ever since Queen Seraphina's death. You see, she didn't die of illness, as the official reports claimed. She was murdered by someone with powerful dark magic, someone who has been working to destabilize the kingdom from within." Lyralei felt the blood drain from her face. "Murdered? But why would the king need someone with foresight to—" She stopped as understanding dawned. "He wants to catch the killer. More than that, the killer has been sending threats, promising to strike again. They seem to know the king's movements, his plans, his weaknesses. Someone with the ability to see the future might be able to anticipate their next move. The implications were staggering. So I'm not really his chosen bride. I'm bait. Lady Morgana's expression softened with something like sympathy. It's more complicated than that, Princess. The king could have simply hired you as an advisor, could have brought you to court in any number of ways, but he chose to make you his queen. That suggests his motivations aren't purely strategic. Before Lyralei could respond, another knock came at the door. This time, it was King Aldric himself who entered, his presence immediately filling the room with an almost tangible energy. He was dressed more casually than she had seen him before, in a simple black tunic and dark trousers, but the aura of power around him was unchanged. "Lady Morgana," he said with a nod to his advisor. "I trust you've been enlightening our princess about the realities of her situation." "I've shared what she needs to know to stay alive, Your Majesty," Lady Morgana replied diplomatically, King Aldric's storm-grey eyes fixed on Lyralei. "And what do you think of these revelations, Princess? Are you ready to flee back to your quiet life with Lord Matthias? Or do you have the courage to help me hunt a killer?" The challenge in his voice sparked something defiant in Lyralei's chest. She had spent her entire life being overlooked and dismissed, treated as if she were fragile and useless. The idea that she might actually possess abilities that could make a difference was both terrifying and exhilarating. "I want to help," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "But I need to understand what I'm capable of. If I truly have this foresight you speak of, I need to learn to control it." A smile ghosted across the king's lips, the same enigmatic expression she had seen at the ritual. "Excellent. Lady Morgana will begin your training tomorrow. Tonight, however, I have something else in mind." He gestured toward the window, where the sun was beginning to set behind the mountains. "There's someone I want you to meet, someone who knew your father better than anyone else alive." An hour later, Lyralei found herself following King Aldric through corridors she had never seen before, deep in the oldest part of the castle. The walls here were made of ancient stone, and the air carried the weight of centuries. Torches flickered in iron sconces, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their flames. "Where are we going?" she asked, as they descended a spiral staircase that seemed to wind endlessly downward. "To the Sanctuary of Memories," the king replied. "It's where the royal family keeps its most precious secrets and its most dangerous knowledge." They emerged into a circular chamber carved directly from the mountain's bedrock. The walls were lined with shelves containing books, scrolls, and artifacts that hummed with magical energy. In the center of the room stood a pool of water so still and clear it looked like liquid glass. But it was the figure seated beside the pool that made Lyralei gasp. At first glance, she appeared to be a young woman, perhaps 25 years old, with long silver hair and eyes like starlight. But there was something ancient about her, something that spoke of centuries rather than decades. "Princess Lyralei," King Aldric said formally, "may I present the Oracle Celestine. She has served House Shadowmere for over 300 years. The Oracle rose gracefully, her movements flowing like water. When she spoke, her voice carried the music of wind chimes and distant thunder. "So you are Demon's daughter. I can see him in your eyes, child. He was dear to me. You knew my father?" Lyralei's voice was thick with emotion. "I knew him, guided him, and mourned him when he was taken from us." The oracle's expression grew sad. "He came to me the night before his death, seeking answers about a vision that had been troubling him. He saw his own death, you see, but also something more. He saw you, grown and powerful, standing at a crossroads that would determine the fate of the kingdom." Lyralei felt a chill run down her spine. "He saw me. He saw you as you are now, chosen by the Shadow King, awakening to your power, facing a choice between safety and sacrifice." The oracle gestured toward the pool. "Would you like to see what he saw?" Before Lyralei could answer, King Aldric placed a hand on her shoulder. "The oracle's visions can be overwhelming for those unprepared. Are you certain you're ready?" Lyralei looked between the king and the oracle, sensing that this moment would change everything. Whatever her father had seen, whatever future awaited her, she needed to know. "Show me." The oracle nodded and gestured for Lyralei to approach the pool. As she knelt beside the still water, Celestine placed her hands on either side of Lyralei's head. "Look into the water, child, and see what was, what is, and what may yet be." The surface of the pool began to shimmer and change, and suddenly Lyralei was no longer in the chamber but standing in a forest clearing under a full moon. She could see her father, as he had been in life, tall and strong, with kind eyes and gentle hands. He was speaking to someone she couldn't see, his expression urgent. "She must be protected," her father was saying. "When the time comes, when the kingdom faces its greatest threat, she will be the key to saving us all. But the choice must be hers. She cannot be forced into her destiny." The vision shifted, and Lyralei saw herself as she was now, standing in the ritual circle as King Aldric extended his hand. But this time she could see the threads of fate and possibility swirling around them like golden light. She saw potential futures branching out like the limbs of a great tree, some leading to happiness and prosperity, others to darkness and death. In one future, she saw herself crowned as queen, standing beside King Aldric as they ruled justly and well. In another, she saw herself fleeing the castle in the dead of night, abandoning her destiny out of fear. And in the darkest vision of all, she saw herself lying dead in a pool of blood while the kingdom burned around her. But there was one more vision, brighter than all the rest. She saw herself wielding magic she had never dreamed possible, her foresight guiding her as she faced a figure cloaked in shadow. The confrontation was fierce and terrible, but in the end, the darkness was defeated and the kingdom was saved. The visions faded, and Lyralei found herself back in the chamber, gasping as if she had been underwater. King Aldric's hand was still on her shoulder, steadying her, while the oracle watched with ancient, knowing eyes. "What did you see?" the king asked quietly. "Choices," Lyralei whispered. "So many choices, and all of them leading to different endings." "That is the burden of foresight," the oracle said gently. "To see the possible futures, but not know which one will come to pass. Your father understood this burden, and now it falls to you." Lyralei looked up at King Aldric, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. He wasn't just the Shadow King, the ruthless ruler who commanded fear and respect. He was a man carrying the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders, fighting an enemy he couldn't see, protecting people who might never know the sacrifices he made for them. "The person who killed Queen Seraphina," she said. "They're still out there, aren't they? Still planning, still threatening." The king's jaw tightened. "Yes, and they're getting bolder. 3 attempts have been made on my life in the past month alone. My shadow magic allows me to defend myself, but I can't be everywhere at once. I can't protect everyone I care about." The admission that he cared about people, that he cared about her, sent warmth spreading through Lyralei's chest. She thought about the visions she had seen, about the future where she stood beside him as his queen and partner. It was possible, but only if she was brave enough to reach for it. "Teach me," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Teach me to use my magic, to see clearly, to be the weapon you need against this enemy. But don't lie to me again. If we're going to do this, if we're going to face this threat together, then we do it as equals. No more secrets, no more half-truths." And King Aldric studied her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe respect. "Very well, princess. No more secrets between us. But you should know that the path we're choosing is dangerous. There's a very real chance that one or both of us won't survive what's coming." "Then we'll face that together too," Lyralei replied, surprised by her own certainty. The oracle smiled, the expression transforming her ancient features. "Your father would be proud, child. You have his courage and his heart." As they made their way back through the castle corridors, King Aldric walked beside Lyralei in comfortable silence. The revelations of the evening had changed something fundamental between them. They were no longer king and reluctant bride, but partners united in purpose. "There's something else you should know," the king said as they reached her chambers. "The wedding has been scheduled for 1 month from today. It will be a grand affair, with representatives from every noble house in attendance." "Including our enemy?" "Almost certainly. It will be the perfect opportunity for them to strike, with so many people gathered in one place and so much chaos to provide cover." His expression was grim. "Which is why we need you trained and ready. The wedding may be our best chance to draw them out and end this threat once and for all." Lyralei nodded, understanding the weight of what lay ahead. 1 month to master abilities she had never known she possessed, to prepare for a confrontation that could determine the fate of the kingdom, and to navigate the complex emotions growing between her and the man she was meant to marry. As she bid the king goodnight and entered her chambers, Lyralei caught sight of herself in the mirror. The frightened, forgotten princess was gone, replaced by someone she barely recognized, someone with purpose and determination burning in her eyes. The game had indeed begun, and now she finally understood the rules. The question was whether she would be strong enough to play it and win. Dawn had barely broken when Lady Morgana arrived at Lyralei's chambers, carrying a leather satchel filled with ancient books and mysterious artifacts. The king's advisor looked as composed as ever, but there was an urgency in her movements that spoke of the limited time they had to prepare. "Your magical education begins now, princess," she announced, setting her materials on the table near the window. "We have 4 weeks to awaken abilities that typically take years to develop. It won't be easy, and it certainly won't be comfortable." Lyralei, who had been awake since before sunrise, thinking about the visions from the oracle's pool, nodded her readiness. "Where do we start?" "With understanding what foresight truly means." Lady Morgana opened one of the ancient tomes, revealing pages covered in symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the morning light. Most people think of prophecy as seeing a fixed future, but that's not accurate. What you're seeing are probability streams, potential outcomes based on current choices and actions. She pointed to a diagram showing branching lines that looked remarkably similar to what Lyralei had seen in her vision. Every decision creates new possibilities, new paths forward. Your gift allows you to perceive these paths and understand their likely consequences, but the future remains changeable until the moment it becomes the present. So I can see what might happen, but not what will definitely happen. Exactly. And that's both the power and the limitation of your ability. Lady Morgana pulled out a crystal sphere that pulsed with inner light. This is a scrying stone, attuned specifically to foresight magic. We'll use it to help you focus and control your visions. The first attempts were frustrating. Lyralei stared into the crystal until her eyes watered, trying to summon the same clarity she had experienced at the oracle's pool. But the stone remained stubbornly opaque, showing her nothing but her own reflection. "You're trying too hard," Lady Morgana observed after the third failed attempt. "Foresight isn't something you force, it's something you allow. Think of it like listening to a distant conversation. The harder you strain to hear, the more the words slip away." Lyralei closed her eyes and tried to relax, letting her mind drift as Lady Morgana had instructed. Gradually, she became aware of a subtle sensation, like the whisper of wind through leaves or the distant sound of water flowing over stones. When she opened her eyes and looked into the crystal again, images began to form. She saw King Aldric in his study, poring over maps and correspondence, but there was something wrong with the scene. Shadows moved independently of their sources, and a sense of danger hung in the air like smoke. As she watched, one of the shadows detached itself from the wall and began moving toward the king with predatory intent. "I see him," she gasped, the vision so vivid it felt real. "The king is in danger. There's something in his study, something made of shadow." Lady Morgana's expression sharpened. "When? Can you tell when this is happening?" Lyralei focused harder, trying to discern details that might indicate timing. The light coming through the windows suggested late afternoon. and she could see papers on the king's desk that looked like the daily reports he typically reviewed after the evening meal. "Tonight," she said with growing certainty. "This is going to happen tonight." Without hesitation, Lady Morgana gathered her materials. "We need to warn him immediately, but first I want you to look deeper. Can you see the source of the shadow? Can you identify who's controlling it?" Lyralei returned her attention to the crystal, pushing her newly awakened abilities to their limit. The vision expanded, showing her the corridors outside the king's study. She saw a figure in a hooded cloak moving through the castle with supernatural stealth, their face hidden, but their intent clear. There was something familiar about their gait, something that nagged at the edge of her consciousness. "I can't see their face," she reported, frustration creeping into her voice. "But there's something. I feel like I should know who this is." "That's enough for now," Lady Morgana decided. "We have a warning to deliver and preparations to make." They found King Aldric in the throne room, hearing petitions from his subjects. Lady Morgana approached the throne with the measured steps of someone who had done this many times before, while Lyralei hung back, still uncertain of her place in the royal hierarchy. "Your Majesty," Lady Morgana said quietly, "we need to speak with you privately. It's urgent." The king's eyes flicked to Lyralei, noting her pale complexion and the tension in her posture. "Clear the hall," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority that made even the most powerful nobles scramble to obey. Once they were alone, Lyralei recounted her vision in detail. King Aldric listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each word. "A shadow assassin," he mused when she finished. "That's a very specific type of magic, and not one that many practitioners possess. It requires both significant power and a complete absence of moral restraint." "Do you have any idea who might be capable of such magic?" Lady Morgana asked. The king was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the arm of his throne. "There are perhaps half a dozen people in the kingdom with that level of shadow manipulation. Most of them are loyal to the crown, but—" He trailed off, his expression troubled. "But?" Lyralei prompted. "There's one possibility I've been reluctant to consider. My cousin, Lord Malakar Shadowmere. He was trained in the same shadow magic as I was, but he always pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable. He disappeared from court shortly after Seraphina's death, claiming he needed time to grieve." Lady Morgana's face went pale. "Malakar? But he's family. Why would he—" "Because he believes he should be king," Aldric said grimly. "He's always resented that my father chose me as heir instead of him. And if he's the one behind these attacks, then he's far more dangerous than I realized." The implications were staggering. A member of the royal family, someone with intimate knowledge of the castle's defenses and the king's routines, working from within to destabilize the kingdom. It explained how the assassin had been able to stay one step ahead of the king's security measures. "What do we do?" Lyralei asked. "We set a trap," King Aldric replied, rising from his throne with predatory grace. "If your vision is accurate, then tonight we'll have our chance to catch him in the act. But it will be dangerous. Shadow magic is unpredictable, and Malakar won't hesitate to kill anyone who gets in his way." "I'm coming with you," Lyralei said immediately. "Absolutely not." The king's tone brooked no argument. "You've had exactly 1 day of magical training. You're not ready for this kind of confrontation." "But I'm the only one who can see the attack coming," she protested. "My foresight might be the difference between success and failure." Lady Morgana stepped forward. "She has a point, Your Majesty, and there are ways to keep her safe while still utilizing her abilities." After much debate, they settled on a plan. Lyralei would be positioned in a secure location with a clear view of the king's study, using her scrying crystal to monitor for threats and communicate warnings. King Aldric would maintain his normal evening routine, but with additional magical protections and backup positioned nearby. As the day wore on, Lyralei found herself growing increasingly nervous. The weight of responsibility was enormous. If her vision was wrong, they would waste valuable resources on a false alarm. If it was right, but she failed to provide adequate warning. The king could die. Evening arrived with agonizing slowness. Lyralei took her position in a hidden alcove overlooking the king's study, the scrying crystal warm in her hands. Lady Morgana had cast several protective spells around her, creating an invisible barrier that would hopefully keep her safe if things went wrong. Through the crystal, she watched King Aldric enter his study and begin his usual review of the day's reports. Everything appeared normal at first. The shadows behaved as shadows should, and no supernatural threats materialized. But as the night deepened, Lyralei began to sense something wrong. The air itself seemed to thicken, and the shadows in the corners of the study grew darker and more substantial. She gripped the crystal tighter, focusing all her attention on the scene below. Then she saw it, a tendril of shadow detaching itself from the wall behind the king's chair, moving with sinuous purpose toward his unprotected back. But this time, her enhanced perception allowed her to trace the shadow to its source. In the corridor outside the study, a figure in a dark cloak was weaving complex magical patterns with their hands. "Now," she whispered into the communication crystal Lady Morgana had given her. "The attack is happening now." The response was immediate. King Aldric spun in his chair just as the shadow tendril reached for him, his own magic flaring to life in a burst of darkness that met and countered the attack. At the same time, the hidden guards burst from their concealment, surrounding the cloaked figure in the corridor. But the assassin was ready for them. With a gesture that sent ice through Lyralei's veins, the figure summoned a wave of shadow that knocked the guards aside like leaves in a hurricane. Then, with inhuman speed, they fled deeper into the castle. "He's getting away," Lyralei reported, tracking the figure's movement through her crystal. "He's heading for the east wing, toward the old tower." King Aldric's voice came through the communication crystal, tight with effort. "I'm in pursuit. Keep tracking him." What followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse through the castle's ancient corridors. Lyralei watched through her scrying crystal as the king pursued his cousin, for she was now certain it was Malakar, through passages and chambers she had never seen before. The assassin's shadow magic allowed him to move with supernatural stealth, but the king's own abilities were equally formidable. The chase ended in the castle's highest tower, a circular chamber that had once been used for astronomical observations. Lyralei's crystal showed her the confrontation in vivid detail as the two cousins faced each other across the stone floor. "Hello, Aldric," Malakar said, pushing back his hood to reveal a face that was a twisted mirror of the king's own features. "I was wondering when you'd finally figure it out." "Why?" King Aldric demanded, his hands wreathed in shadow magic. "Why kill Seraphina? Why try to destroy everything our family has built?" Malakar's laugh was bitter and cold. "Because it should have been mine, all of it. I was the stronger mage, the better warrior, the more ruthless leader. But your father chose you because you were more stable, more diplomatic. He chose weakness over strength. And for that, innocent people had to die." "Seraphina wasn't innocent," Malakar snarled. "She was carrying your heir, the next generation of unworthy rulers. I couldn't allow that bloodline to continue." The revelation hit Lyralei like a physical blow. Queen Seraphina had been pregnant when she was murdered. Malakar hadn't just killed the king's wife, but his unborn child as well. The battle that followed was unlike anything Lyralei had ever witnessed. The two men wielded shadow magic with deadly precision, their attacks creating patterns of darkness and light that danced across the tower walls. Malakar was indeed powerful, his magic raw and vicious, but King Aldric fought with the controlled fury of a man seeking justice for his murdered family. As Lyralei watched, she began to see probability streams forming around the combatants. Most of them showed King Aldric emerging victorious, but there were darker possibilities, futures where Malakar's desperation led him to use forbidden magic that could destroy them both. "Be careful," she whispered into her communication crystal. "He's going to try something desperate. I can see it building." Sure enough, Malakar began weaving a spell that made the very air around him writhe with malevolent energy. It was magic that Lyralei instinctively knew was forbidden, the kind that required a terrible price from its caster. Soul magic, Lady Morgana's voice came through the crystal, tight with horror. He's going to sacrifice his own life force for one final attack. The king needs to get out of there, but King Aldric either couldn't hear the warning or couldn't retreat without giving Malakar the opportunity to escape. The forbidden spell reached its crescendo, and Malakar unleashed a wave of pure destructive force that should have been impossible to survive. What happened next defied all expectation. Just as the deadly magic reached King Aldric, a barrier of silver light sprang up around him, not his own shadow magic, but something else entirely. The forbidden spell shattered against the barrier like waves against a cliff, and the backlash struck Malakar with the full force of his own attack. Through her crystal, Lyralei saw the assassin crumple to the ground, his life force consumed by the very magic he had tried to wield. King Aldric stood unharmed in the center of the chamber, staring at the silver barrier that was slowly fading around him. "How?" he said aloud, his voice carrying clearly through the communication crystal. Lyralei looked down at her own hands and gasped. They were glowing with the same silver light that had protected the king, and she could feel power flowing through her like a river of starlight. Somehow, without conscious thought or training, she had reached across the distance between them and shielded him with her own magic. "Princess!" Lady Morgana's voice was filled with awe. "Was that you?" I think so," Lyralei whispered, staring at her hands as the glow slowly faded. "I saw him in danger and I just reacted." The implications were staggering. Not only did she possess foresight, but she had just demonstrated a level of protective magic that typically took decades to master. The forgotten princess was proving to be far more powerful than anyone had imagined. As King Aldric made his way back through the castle, Lyralei remained in her alcove, trying to process what had just happened. She had saved the king's life, helped bring a murderer to justice, and discovered abilities she never knew she possessed. But more than that, she had felt the connection between them when her magic reached out to protect him. A bond that went deeper than political alliance or royal duty. When the king finally reached her hiding place, his expression was a mixture of gratitude, amazement, and something that might have been the beginning of genuine affection. "Thank you," he said simply, taking her hands in his. "You saved my life tonight." "We saved each other," Lyralei replied, understanding that this was true in more ways than one. The threat that had hung over the kingdom for 3 years was finally ended, but Lyralei sensed that this was just the beginning of their story together. The forgotten princess had found her power, her purpose, and perhaps something even more precious, a connection with the man who had chosen her when no one else would. As they stood together in the moonlight streaming through the castle windows, Lyralei realized that her father's vision was coming true. She was indeed standing at a crossroads that would determine the fate of the kingdom, and she had chosen the path that led toward light rather than darkness. The wedding was still 3 weeks away, but in her heart she was already bound to the Shadow King, not by duty or political necessity, but by the silver threads of magic and the golden bonds of growing love. The weeks following Malakar's defeat transformed the castle from a place of hidden threats into something approaching a true home. With the immediate danger past, King Aldric seemed to shed some of the cold remoteness that had defined his public persona, revealing glimpses of the man beneath the crown. Lyralei found herself looking forward to their daily meetings, which had evolved from formal briefings into genuine conversations about everything from kingdom management to childhood memories. "Tell me about your father," Aldric said one afternoon as they walked through the castle's gardens. It had become their custom to take these walks when the day's official business was concluded, a time when they could speak freely without the watchful eyes of the court. Lyralei smiled at the memory. He was everything a father should be: kind, patient, endlessly curious about the world. He used to take me on long rides through the countryside, pointing out different plants and animals, telling me stories about the kingdom's history. Her expression grew wistful. He had this way of making even the most ordinary moments feel magical. "I remember him from my childhood," Aldric admitted. "He was always laughing, always surrounded by people who genuinely loved him rather than feared him. I used to wonder what it would be like to be that kind of leader." "You could be," Lyralei said softly. "The people respect you, but they could love you too if you let them see who you really are." Aldric's smile was rueful. "The Shadow King doesn't inspire love, Princess. Fear and respect are safer. They don't leave you vulnerable to betrayal, but they also don't leave room for genuine connection. And without that," she gestured around them at the beautiful but empty gardens, "what's the point of ruling over a kingdom if you're completely alone in it?" It was a conversation they'd had variations of many times, and Lyralei could see her words taking root in his mind. The man who had been shaped by loss and betrayal was slowly beginning to consider the possibility of trust again. Their magical training had continued as well, with Lady Morgana marveling at the rapid development of Lyralei's abilities. The protective magic she had manifested during the confrontation with Malakar proved to be just one facet of a complex magical gift that seemed to grow stronger each day. "Your power is unlike anything I've encountered," Lady Morgana explained during one of their sessions. "Most mages specialize in one particular type of magic, shadow manipulation like the king, or elemental control, or healing arts. But you seem to have access to multiple schools of magic simultaneously. Is that unusual? It's unprecedented. The only reference I can find to similar abilities is in the oldest texts about the founding of House Shadowmere. Legend speaks of a queen who could weave multiple types of magic together, creating effects that were greater than the sum of their parts." The implications were intriguing, but Lyralei found herself more interested in the practical applications of her growing abilities. She had begun using her foresight to help with kingdom administration, identifying potential problems before they became crises and suggesting solutions that others might not have considered. King Aldric had initially been skeptical of involving her in governance, but her insights had proven invaluable. Trade disputes that might have escalated into conflicts were resolved through diplomatic approaches she had foreseen. Natural disasters were prepared for in advance, minimizing their impact on the kingdom's people. "You're going to make an excellent queen," he told her one evening, as they reviewed reports from the kingdom's various provinces. "Not just because of your magic, but because you genuinely care about the people we serve." The compliment warmed her heart, but it also highlighted the strange nature of their relationship. They were engaged to be married, spending increasing amounts of time together and developing what felt like genuine affection for each other. Yet, there had been no romantic overtures, no declarations of love, no moments of physical intimacy beyond the occasional touch of hands. Lyralei found herself wondering if Aldric saw her only as a valuable political and magical asset, or if there was something deeper growing between them. The uncertainty was maddening, especially as she became increasingly aware of her own feelings. The answer came unexpectedly on a night when sleep eluded her. Restless and unable to settle, she decided to walk through the castle's quieter corridors, hoping the exercise would tire her enough to rest. As she passed the king's private study, she noticed light still flickering under the door. She knocked softly, and Aldric's voice invited her to enter. She found him seated at his desk, but instead of the usual reports and correspondence, he was holding a small portrait in a silver frame. Even from across the room, she could see it was a painting of Queen Seraphina. "I'm sorry," she said, starting to retreat. "I didn't mean to intrude on a private moment." "Stay," he said quietly, setting the portrait aside. "I was just remembering." Lyralei approached slowly, noting the sadness in his expression. "You loved her very much." "I did. We were childhood friends before we were anything else, and our marriage was one of the rare royal unions that was based on genuine affection rather than political necessity." He was quiet for a moment, lost in memory. "She would have been a wonderful mother." The pain in his voice made Lyralei's heart ache for him. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Both losses." Aldric looked up at her with surprise. "You know about the child? I saw it in Malakar's mind during the confrontation. The cruelty of what he did." She shook her head, unable to find adequate words. "For 3 years, I've been afraid to let anyone get close again. The thought of losing someone else I cared about seemed unbearable." He stood and moved to the window, staring out at the moonlit gardens. "But you've made me realize that isolation isn't protection. It's just another kind of death." Lyralei joined him at the window, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. "What are you saying?" He turned to face her, and in his storm-grey eyes she saw vulnerability that took her breath away. "I'm saying that what began as a strategic alliance has become something else entirely. I'm saying that I've fallen in love with you, Lyralei, and I'm terrified of what that means." The confession hung in the air between them, fragile and precious as spun glass. Lyralei felt her heart racing as she searched his face, seeing truth and fear and hope warring in his expression. "I love you too," she whispered, the words feeling both natural and miraculous. "I think I started falling for you the moment you extended your hand at the ritual, when you chose me, despite every logical reason not to." The kiss that followed was gentle at first, tentative, as if they were both afraid that too much passion might shatter the fragile trust they had built. But as Lyralei melted into his embrace, feeling the solid warmth of him against her, the kiss deepened into something that spoke of promises and possibilities, and a future they might build together. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Lyralei could see her own wonder and desire reflected in Aldric's eyes. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Once we cross this line, there's no going back. You'll be bound to a man who has made countless enemies, who carries the weight of a kingdom's expectations, who may not always be able to put your happiness before duty." Lyralei reached up to cup his face in her hands, marveling at the way he leaned into her touch like a man starved for affection. "I'm not looking for an easy life, Aldric. I'm looking for a meaningful one. And I can't imagine anything more meaningful than standing beside you, facing whatever challenges come our way together." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise after the longest night. "Then we'll face them together," he promised, pulling her close again. "My queen, my partner, my heart." The next morning brought a flurry of activity as news of the king's genuine affection for his bride-to-be spread through the castle. The upcoming wedding, which had been viewed by many as a political necessity, suddenly took on the character of a true celebration. Servants hummed as they worked, courtiers spoke in excited whispers about the romantic transformation of their notoriously cold king, and even the castle's stones seemed to radiate warmth. Lady Morgana found Lyralei in her chambers, where she was being fitted for her wedding gown by a team of seamstresses who chatted excitedly about the upcoming ceremony. "Your Highness," the advisor said with a knowing smile, "you're positively glowing this morning. I take it your evening walk was illuminating?" Lyralei blushed but couldn't suppress her own smile. "Very illuminating, though I suspect you already knew what would happen." "I had my suspicions. The king has been different these past weeks, more human, more hopeful. It was clear that you were having an effect on him." Lady Morgana's expression grew more serious. "But I hope you understand that this changes the stakes considerably. You're no longer just a strategic asset or even just a future queen. You're now the most precious thing in the king's world, which makes you an incredibly valuable target." The warning sobered Lyralei's mood somewhat. "Do you think there are other threats we haven't identified?" "There are always other threats. Malakar may have been the most immediate danger, but he wasn't operating in complete isolation. There are other nobles who resent the king's power, other kingdoms that would benefit from Ethermore's instability, other forces that thrive in chaos and conflict." As if summoned by their conversation, a knock came at the door. A young page entered, bowing nervously before delivering his message. "Your Highness, His Majesty requests your immediate presence in the throne room. He says it's urgent." Lyralei exchanged a concerned glance with Lady Morgana before hurrying through the castle corridors. She found Aldric in deep conversation with several members of his council, their expressions grave. When he saw her enter, relief flickered across his features. "What's wrong?" she asked without preamble. "We've received a message," Aldric said, holding up a scroll sealed with black wax. "It arrived this morning by Raven, addressed to both of us." Lyralei felt a chill of premonition as she approached the throne. "What does it say?" Aldric broke the seal and unrolled the parchment, his jaw tightening as he read. "It's from someone calling themselves the Shadow Weaver. They claim to have been Malakar's teacher and patron, and they're displeased with his demise. What do they want? Revenge. They're threatening to disrupt the wedding and kill everyone in attendance unless I abdicate the throne and name them as my successor." Aldric's voice was steady, but Lyralei could see the tension in his shoulders. They claim to have infiltrated the castle staff and positioned assassins throughout the kingdom. Lord Commander Garrett, the head of the King's Guard, stepped forward. "Your Majesty, we should postpone the wedding until we can identify and eliminate this threat." "No," Lyralei said firmly, surprising everyone in the room. "That's exactly what they want, to disrupt our lives, to make us afraid, to prove that they have power over us." "Princess," Lord Commander Garrett said respectfully, "with all due respect, this threat appears to be quite serious. We have no way of knowing how many agents this Shadow Weaver has in place." Lyralei looked at Aldric, seeing her own determination reflected in his eyes. "Then we use that against them. We proceed with the wedding as planned, but we turn it into a trap." "Explain," Aldric said, leaning forward with interest. "My foresight has been growing stronger. If I can get close enough to the Shadow Weaver's agents, I should be able to identify them before they can act. We invite every noble house in the kingdom, just as planned, but we also position our own people throughout the crowd. When the assassins reveal themselves, we'll be ready." Lady Morgana nodded slowly. "It's risky, but it could work. The princess's abilities have proven remarkably accurate, and a public victory over this threat would send a powerful message to any other potential enemies." The debate that followed was intense, with various council members arguing for and against the plan. Some favored postponement and a methodical investigation, while others supported a more aggressive approach. In the end, it was Aldric who made the final decision. "We proceed as planned," he announced, "but with additional security measures and contingencies. If this Shadow Weaver wants to face us, they'll do it on our terms, not theirs." The week leading up to the wedding was a careful balance of celebration and preparation. Publicly, the castle buzzed with excitement as guests arrived from across the kingdom and beyond. Privately, every servant was vetted, every guest was watched, and every possible threat was analyzed and planned for. Lyralei spent her days practicing with her scrying crystal, learning to identify the subtle signs that might indicate hostile intent. Her foresight showed her fragments of possible futures, flashes of violence, moments of danger, glimpses of faces she didn't recognize but somehow knew to fear. "I can see them," she told Aldric during one of their evening strategy sessions. "Not clearly, but I can sense their presence. There are at least 3, maybe 4, positioned among the wedding guests. They're planning something during the ceremony itself. Can you identify them specifically?" "Not yet, but I'm getting closer. There's something about their magical signatures that feels familiar, like an echo of Malakar's power, but different. Older, maybe, or more refined." The night before the wedding, Lyralei found herself unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. She stood at her window, looking out at the castle grounds where tomorrow hundreds of people would gather to witness her marriage to the Shadow King. Some would come with genuine joy and celebration, others with political calculations and hidden agendas, and a few with murder in their hearts. A soft knock at her door interrupted her brooding. She opened it to find Aldric standing in the corridor, looking as restless as she felt. "I couldn't sleep either," he admitted. "Tomorrow changes everything." "Are you having second thoughts?" she asked, though she was fairly certain she knew the answer. "About marrying you? Never. About putting you in danger? Every moment." He stepped into her room, closing the door behind him. "I keep thinking about all the ways this could go wrong, all the ways I could lose you before we've even had a chance to truly begin." Lyralei moved into his arms, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "Then don't think about losing me. Think about all the ways it could go right. Think about the future we're going to build together, the kingdom we're going to protect, the love we're going to share." "You make it sound so simple." "Love is simple. It's everything else that's complicated." She pulled back to look into his eyes. "But whatever happens tomorrow, whatever challenges we face them together. That's what marriage means. Choosing each other again and again, no matter what." The kiss they shared was different from their first. Deeper, more urgent, filled with the knowledge that tomorrow might bring danger, but also with the certainty that they would meet it united. When they finally parted, both knew that whatever the Shadow Weaver had planned, it would not break the bond they had forged. "I love you," Aldric whispered against her hair. "Whatever happens tomorrow, remember that." "I love you too," she replied. "And tomorrow, the whole kingdom will witness that love. Let the Shadow Weaver try to destroy something so powerful, they'll find it's not as easy as they think." As dawn approached, bringing with it the day that would either see them crowned as king and queen united in love and purpose, or would test the very foundations of everything they had built together, Lyralei felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. The forgotten princess had found her place, her power, and her purpose. Whatever came next, she would face it as a queen in truth as well as title. The game was entering its final phase, and this time she was ready to play to win. The great cathedral of Ethermore had never looked more magnificent. Thousands of white roses cascaded from the ancient stone pillars, their petals catching the colored lights streaming through stained glass windows that depicted the kingdom's legendary history. The air hummed with anticipation as representatives from every noble house in the realm took their seats, their finest silks and jewels creating a tapestry of wealth and power. Lyralei stood in the cathedral's preparation chamber, surrounded by Lady Morgana and her attendants, as they made final adjustments to her wedding gown. The dress was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, ivory silk embroidered with silver threads that seemed to capture and reflect light like captured starshine. The train stretched behind her for several feet, and the veil was held in place by a circlet of diamonds that had belonged to queens of Ethermore for 3 centuries. "You look radiant, Your Highness," Lady Morgana said, though her eyes held the same tension that had gripped the entire castle for days. "Are you ready?" Lyralei nodded, though her stomach churned with a mixture of wedding nerves and the awareness that somewhere in the cathedral, assassins waited for their moment to strike. Her scrying crystal, disguised as part of her jewelry, pulsed gently against her throat, a constant reminder of the magical sight that would be their primary defense against the coming threat. "I can sense them," she said quietly, closing her eyes to focus on the impressions flooding through her enhanced perception. 4 of them, positioned at different points throughout the cathedral. They're waiting for a specific moment, something during the ceremony itself. "The exchange of vows," Lady Morgana suggested. "No, something later, when we're vulnerable, when our attention is focused on each other rather than the crowd." Lyralei's eyes snapped open as understanding dawned. The kiss. They're planning to strike during the ceremonial kiss, when tradition requires us to turn our backs to the congregation. Lady Morgana's expression hardened. "I'll signal the guards. They'll be ready." The sound of trumpets echoed through the cathedral, announcing the beginning of the ceremony. Lyralei took a deep breath, centering herself as she had learned to do during her magical training. Today, she was not just a bride, she was a queen stepping into her power, a protector of her people, and a woman ready to fight for the love she had found. The great doors of the cathedral opened, and Lyralei began her walk down the aisle. The assembled nobility rose as one, their faces a mixture of curiosity, approval, and in some cases, barely concealed calculation. She could feel the weight of their expectations, their judgments, their hopes for what kind of queen she would become. But all of that faded into background noise when she saw Aldric waiting for her at the altar. He was magnificent in his ceremonial robes, deep blue velvet trimmed with silver, the crown of Ethermore resting on his dark hair, and his storm-grey eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart race. In that moment, she forgot about assassins and political intrigue and magical threats. There was only the man she loved, waiting to make her his queen. The ceremony proceeded with ancient ritual and solemn words that had bound royal couples for generations. High Priestess Morwen, despite her great age, spoke with a voice that carried clearly throughout the cathedral as she invoked the blessings of the old gods and the new. When the time came for vows, Lyralei and Aldric spoke words they had written themselves, promises that went beyond duty and politics to touch on the deeper truths of their connection. "I choose you," Aldric said, his voice steady despite the emotion she could see in his eyes, "not because of prophecy or political necessity, but because you have shown me that strength and gentleness can coexist, that power shared is power multiplied, and that love is the greatest magic of all." "Or I choose you," Lyralei replied, her own voice carrying clearly through the cathedral, "not because you are a king, but because you are a man who carries the weight of a kingdom with honor, who protects those who cannot protect themselves, and who has taught me that being chosen is less important than choosing to be worthy of that choice." The exchange of rings followed, ancient bands of gold and silver that had been worn by rulers of Ethermore for centuries. As Aldric slipped the queen's ring onto her finger, Lyralei felt a surge of power that had nothing to do with magic, and everything to do with the completion of something that had been building between them since that first moment in the ritual circle. High Priestess Morwen raised her hands, her blind eyes somehow finding both bride and groom with unerring accuracy. "By the power vested in me by the ancient laws of this kingdom, by the blessing of the gods both old and new, and by the witness of all assembled here, I pronounce you husband and wife, king and queen of Ethermore. You may seal your union with a kiss." This was the moment. As Aldric stepped closer, his hands coming up to frame her face, Lyralei's magical senses screamed a warning. She could feel the assassins moving, could sense the deadly intent focusing on them like arrows drawn back on bowstrings. But instead of pulling away, instead of alerting the guards, she made a different choice. As Aldric's lips met hers in the kiss that would seal their marriage, she reached out with her magic, not to defend, but to reveal. Silver light erupted from her, washing over the entire cathedral like a wave of starshine. The light was harmless to those with pure intent, but to those who carried darkness in their hearts, it was like being touched by fire. 4 figures throughout the congregation suddenly became visible as they writhed in agony, their magical disguises burned away by Lyralei's power. The response was immediate and coordinated. The king's guard, positioned throughout the cathedral, moved with practiced precision to subdue the revealed assassins. But the Shadow Weaver's agents were not ordinary killers. They fought with magic and skill that spoke of extensive training. One of the assassins, a woman disguised as a minor noble from the eastern provinces, summoned a whirlwind of shadow blades that scattered the guards attempting to reach her. Another, a man who had been posing as a servant, began weaving a spell that would have brought the cathedral's ancient roof crashing down on the assembled guests. But they had not counted on facing a queen who had come into her full power. Lyralei stepped away from Aldric, her wedding gown transforming as silver light continued to pour from her. The ivory silk seemed to become liquid starlight, and the diamond circlet on her head blazed like a captured star. "Enough," she said, and her voice carried the authority of someone who had finally understood the true scope of her abilities. The protective magic she had used to save Aldric during his confrontation with Malakar was nothing compared to what she wielded now. Silver barriers sprang up around each assassin, containing their magic and rendering their weapons useless. The shadow blades dissolved like mist, the destructive spell collapsed harmlessly, and the 4 agents of the Shadow Weaver found themselves trapped in cages of pure light. But even as the immediate threat was contained, Lyralei's foresight showed her something that made her blood run cold. The real attack wasn't coming from the assassins in the cathedral. They were a distraction. The true threat was approaching the castle itself, where the wedding feast was to be held and where the kingdom's most important leaders would be gathered in celebration. "Aldric," she said urgently, turning to her new husband, "this isn't over. The real attack is coming, and it's going to be at the feast." The king's expression hardened as he processed her warning. Around them, the cathedral was in controlled chaos as the guards secured the captured assassins, and the noble guests tried to understand what had just happened. But Aldric's focus was entirely on his queen. "How many?" he asked. "I can't tell exactly, but it's more than just a few assassins. This feels like an army." Lyralei closed her eyes, pushing her foresight to its limits. "They're using the underground passages beneath the castle, the old smuggler's tunnels that most people have forgotten about." "Not everyone has forgotten," Aldric said grimly. "Malakar knew about those tunnels. If this Shadow Weaver was truly his teacher, they would know about them too." The decision was made quickly. While the majority of the guests were evacuated to safety, a core group of the kingdom's most trusted defenders prepared for what might be the final confrontation with the forces that had been threatening Ethermore for years. Lyralei insisted on being part of the defensive force, despite Aldric's protests. "We're stronger together," she reminded him, as they made their way through the castle's corridors. "My foresight can guide us, and my protective magic can shield our people. You need me with you." The attack, when it came, was unlike anything the kingdom had ever faced. The Shadow Weaver had indeed assembled an army, not of ordinary soldiers, but of mages corrupted by dark magic, creatures summoned from shadow realms and assassins trained in arts that bordered on the forbidden. They poured through the underground tunnels like a tide of darkness, their magic eating away at light and hope wherever they passed. But they met resistance they had not expected. A queen whose power had been awakened not by fear or desperation, but by love and the determination to protect everything she held dear. The battle raged through the castle's halls, a conflict between light and shadow that would be remembered in songs and stories for generations to come. Lyralei fought beside her husband, her silver magic complementing his shadow abilities in ways that created effects neither could have achieved alone. When shadow creatures threatened to overwhelm their defenders, Lyralei's light burned them away. When dark magic sought to corrupt the very stones of the castle, Aldric's shadows absorbed and redirected the attack. Together, they were more than the sum of their parts, a living symbol of the balance between different types of power. The climax came when the Shadow Weaver finally revealed themselves. They were ancient beyond measure, a figure whose features seemed to shift between human and something far more sinister. Their power was immense, drawn from centuries of study and sacrifice, and they wielded it with the skill of someone who had never known defeat. "You think your little light show can stand against the darkness I command?" The Shadow Weaver taunted as they faced Lyralei and Aldric in the castle's great hall. "I have been perfecting these arts since before your kingdom was founded. I have seen empires rise and fall, and I will see yours crumble to dust." "Perhaps," Lyralei replied, stepping forward with her hand clasped in Aldric's. "But you've made one crucial mistake." "And what is that, little queen?" "You think power comes from taking, from consuming, from destroying. But the greatest power comes from giving, from creating, from protecting." She raised her free hand, and silver light began to gather around her fingers. "You've spent centuries learning to tear things apart. We've learned to build them up. The magic that erupted from the joined hands of the king and queen, was unlike anything that had ever been seen in Ethermoor. Silver light and flowing shadow wove together in patterns that spoke of harmony rather than conflict, of balance rather than domination. The Shadow Weaver's dark magic met this combined force and simply dissolved. For the first time in centuries, the ancient enemy knew fear. They tried to flee, to disappear into the shadow realms from which they had drawn their power, but Lyralei's foresight had anticipated this. Her magic followed them into the darkness, and Aldric's shadows ensured there was nowhere to hide. When the light finally faded, the Shadow Weaver was gone. Not destroyed, perhaps, but banished to realms so distant that they would never again threaten the kingdom of Ethermoor. The celebration that followed was unlike any in the kingdom's history. Not only had the royal couple been wed, but they had also proven themselves as defenders of the realm in the most dramatic way possible. The Forgotten Princess and the Shadow King had become the Queen of Light and the King of Shadows, rulers whose combined power promised an era of unprecedented peace and prosperity. As they stood on the castle's highest balcony, looking out over a kingdom that was finally truly safe, Lyralei reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the ritual circle where she had been chosen against all odds, to the magical awakening that had revealed her true nature, to the love that had transformed them both. Every step had led to this. "Do you ever regret it?" Aldric asked, his arm around her waist as they watched the sun set over their domain. "Giving up your quiet life for all of this?" Lyralei smiled, thinking of the shy, forgotten girl who had stood at the back of the crowd just months ago. "How can I regret finding my true self? How can I regret discovering that I was capable of so much more than I ever imagined?" "And the love?" he asked quietly. "Do you regret that?" She turned in his arms, seeing her own happiness reflected in his storm-grey eyes. "Never. That most of all. Everything else, the magic, the crown, the power, it's all just window dressing. The love is what makes it real." As they kissed beneath the first stars of evening, silver light and gentle shadows danced around them, a visible symbol of the balance they had brought to the kingdom and to each other. The Forgotten Princess had become a queen, the Shadow King had learned to love again, and Ethermoor had found rulers who would protect it, not out of duty alone, but out of genuine care for every life within its borders. The game that had begun with a ritual and a choice had ended with a victory that was more complete than anyone could have imagined. And in the years that followed, when bards sang of the Queen of Light and the King of Shadows, they would always begin with the same words. No one wanted the Forgotten Princess at the ritual, until the Shadow King took her hand and everything changed forever. This epic fantasy explores themes of destiny, self-discovery, and the transformative power of love. Through Lyralei's journey from Forgotten Princess to powerful Queen, it examines how true strength comes not from individual power, but from the connections we forge with others and the courage to embrace our authentic selves. The story celebrates the idea that sometimes the most unlikely choices lead to the most extraordinary destinies.